All right. Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to our presentation on artificial light's effect on nature. I'm going to hand it over to Don. All I want you folks to know that are joining us in the live stream is please put your questions in either the Whova Q&A or Whova chat or the Zoom chat if you can access that. And we'll take questions at the end. On to you, Don.
Thank you. So my name is Don Ficken. I'm president of the International Dark Sky Association. I'm glad to talk with you today a little bit about artificial light's effect on nature. So one of the things that a lot of us have thought about over the years is the issue of pollution. Air pollution obviously has been a big one, soil pollution and water pollution. But it wasn't really until just recently that people started thinking about a thing called light pollution, which is nothing more than the inappropriate or excess of use of artificial light at night. I want to set the stage here talking about the type of natural light, the things that has been around for billions of years. Of course, we know about daytime. Obviously, this is sunlight. This is what powers the sun powers our planet, keeps us warm, and grows our plants. There's what's called twilight. Twilight is when the sun begins setting. It takes about an hour to get to total darkness, if you will. And that's a very important time for nature and even humans to really start transitioning to nightlife. That's when melatonin starts kicking in. And then you have what's called moonlight. And as it turns out, moonlight is actually, the moon is actually up half the time at night. It could be in different phases. It could be at different parts of the cycle, but basically there's some moonlight about half the nights of the year. And then there's what's called darkness. And what I mean darkness, there's no moon. It's just Milky Way, our stars. And really nature, this whole cycle of these four different pieces have been around for billions of years. Now climate has changed. We've had warmer planet and colder planet at different times, but this cycle is something that nature has relied on for their entire evolution. So let's talk about artificial light. Man is not really very comfortable with light at all, with darkness rather, and so they have harnessed fire to keep them warm, to really light up the night, to keep away the wolves or whatever else it is. And of course, in the 1880s, we had our first power plant. Thomas Edison invented the incandescent bulb, and that started to transition to where we began lighting up our houses. And by the 1940s, we had power in probably most of the houses with light. And then in the 1970s, we had LED lights, and that's a new technology that came along that actually made lights last longer and save energy. And that became so prominent that really we started putting more and more bulbs in. They last longer, save energy, brightness, more brightness really must be better. That's a good thing. And along with that, interestingly, we went from, on the left-hand side on this chart, where there's a warm light of, say, 1,000 Kelvin, we started brightening up our lights to a much wider. And that doesn't really affect us so much, but in the world of nature, nature has a much wider scale of vision of basically than we do. And so they can see beyond our range. It's very disruptive to them. Well, let's face it, we really love light. We light up our houses. In this case, it's very pretty to look at a house that's all lit up. Gas stations a few years ago figured out that if you start lighting up the gas station, and particularly if you can see that far off, it'll be something that maybe you'll come to the gas station because you just love it. We're sort of like moss, if you will, drawn to the light. And of course, what that does is it shows up in our cities. Everything is lit up. You can see everywhere lights, particularly from the satellites looking down. So the impact of all this is that we start seeing basically what's called sky glow off in the distance. You can hardly go anywhere anymore and not see some kind of sky glow off in the distance. But it's not just sky glow. It's really things like glare. And what we get a lot of calls on on IDA Missouri is basically light trespass. Somebody has lights shining in my windows, or something's coming up and it's really messing up my windows or whatever I was looking at the light. And then you've got clutter, which could be multiple lights basically at one time. So what's interesting, a couple of years ago, some scientists started saying, well, let's take our satellite data and population data, and let's make a color-coded map of the world, actually, and we're going to focus on the U.S. here. In this case, you can see this is basically the late 1950s. You can see already St. Louis and Kansas City starting to light up a little bit. But on the West Coast, I mean, if you go to the west, it's pretty dark. There's a few spots here and there. Let's move on to the middle 1970s. You can start seeing very quickly that it's getting lighter. Everything's getting a little bit brighter, particularly on the East Coast. And then we go to the 1997 range. And now you're starting to see kind of a tsunami of light heading from the East Coast to the West Coast. And you can definitely see, once again, St. Louis and Kansas City right there. So this is what they're looking at right now for the 2025 range. And you can see that there's going to be very few pockets of darkness really left, particularly from our state to the east. And focusing a little bit more on just our state, you can see there are the cities, some of the major cities, and we still have a few pockets of darkness. So today, light pollution is growing something like at 2% per year worldwide, and 88% of the U.S. and Europe are basically in perpetual twilight. A third of mankind can't even see the Milky Way anymore at all worldwide. So what does that have why do we care about that? I mean, it's just light. Like you turn lights on, they turn lights off. What's the big deal? Well, it has a significant impact on wildlife. It's known to harm a vast array of species, and really nearly every organism studied has had some kind of response. Sometimes they react biologically, sometimes based on their environment, sometimes it's both. Some do better than others, but basically there has some kind of impact. And they impact in multiple ways. Well, first off, there's about 30% of vertebrae and over 60% of invertebrate are nocturnal. And what they do is they affect the way they orientate or navigate, and how they predate. In other words, their food, their competition, their reproduction. For example, the flashing sign of fireflies. Once you get to the first quarter moon, fireflies don't like to blink anymore. And then you get into what's called circadian rhythms. Now, the lowly insect, we don't think much about insects, but insects are declining very rapidly. And one of our board members is a behavioral ecologist, really loves insects, focusing on moss, whatever else. And he talks about pollination and pest control and food and decomposition. The insects are important to our planet. Yet the Earth's population of insects are declining significantly, particularly in the North America and the Midwest. And what he notes to me is that there's over 200 studies showing impacts of light pollution on insect populations. If we look at amphibians, they're very insensitive to environmental changes. They're declining worldwide. Of course, a lot of it's habitat. They tend to forage at night to avoid predators. The salamanders do, but it never gets dark enough, so they don't always eat as they're supposed to. And the foraging and reproduction rates decline because of that. If you take tree frogs, for example, they stop calling for mates in brightly lit areas. One project we've been working on is the issue of bird migration. You can see right here in the blue, Mississippi flyway is something that we're all pretty much in as far as in Missouri, and it's a very significant flyway, one of the biggest flyways in the world. And most birds migrate at night. Yet what happened is that there was a Cornell study recently, and this is a sad thing, I guess, in 2019, and it looked at the 125 largest urban cities. And here we are in spring. St. Louis is the 5th most dayless in that rank, and in fall, the 6th most dayless. And then Kansas City is the 7th most dayless in the spring and the 8th in the fall. Some estimated 600 million birds die per year, basically from bird collisions. They get disoriented, confused by the light, or they get exhausted by trying to fly around some light source, then they don't really know how to get out. And what we've determined is that turning off lights can help. And so there's been some studies, and there's a lot of information in the National Audubon Society where they're realizing that turning off lights can help, and there's lights out programs throughout the country. We really have to think about everything we're talking about in terms of ecosystems. The ecosystems are very important in terms of artificial light. If you disrupt one thing slightly, it impacts something else, and that can really mess up how things work together, basically. One of our projects in IDA, Missouri, and with a lot of the Audubon societies and conservation groups is to basically encourage businesses and homeowners to turn out their lights during May and September. What we're trying to do is make birds make birds as safe as possible as they migrate between their nesting and winter grounds. You can see here we've got a lot of different partners, including the Gateway Arch, by the way, in St. Louis, the Audubon societies, and all over the state. And we've got Arkansas, Tennessee, and Iowa involved. The project is called Lights Out Heartland. And you can see right here, we're asking building owners in this case to turn off their unnecessary exterior and interior lighting, basically turn off put things on timers when they can, make sure that lights are down shielded and turned off as much as possible. And that you can learn more about that at lightsoutheartland.org/buildings. We encourage you to talk to businesses to actually see if they can become part of this. There are 5 principles that IDA has worked with a group called the Illuminating Society of America, and it's the 5 principles include all lights should have a clear purpose. They should be targeted. In other words, lights should be directed only to where needed. They should be no brighter than necessary. They should be only used when it is useful through control and as warm as possible. And I can give a couple examples of these are this. You've got, let's say you've got a light like this. It's a very bright light. It shines up into the sky as well as onto the ground. Well, anything above this red light is really nothing more than wasted light. So even though it looks pretty from the satellites, obviously, or from above, let's say you're in a plane, it's really just wasting light. It not only wastes light in terms of energy, but it's very disruptive to, say, the birds flying or to ecosystems. The advance of technology, and of course LEDs are really part of new technology, but we also have other kinds of technology. We have timers, for example. You could turn lights off, maybe you leave them on just for a short time, but you could turn them off at 9 or 10 o'clock at night. Or maybe you can have them on dimmers to where they don't need to be always as bright as they might be today. And if you have a dimmer, you could dim them down a little bit, which is really good. And most importantly, like photocells, a lot of people leave lights on all night thinking that it's safer. The truth is, if it's bright all night, you probably really never notice a criminal coming by. But if it comes on when a person walks up, you're more likely to see that. And frankly, it's probably more likely to startle them. Photocells can be a big factor in terms of technology. The color spectrum is something that most of us don't think about. In fact, if most of us don't look at the back of basically a box of bulbs that you're buying it. But most of the bulbs or the things that you buy today will have some kind of lighting facts. And what you'd like to do is really stay on the warmer side. You can see here that this little scale's got a warm as 2700. And the biggest scale on the left-hand side, you can see that the 1000 Kelvin is much warmer. It's more of the candlelight, whereas the 10,000 is more like the night, basically the blue sky of day. So what we want to do is we want to keep it down to that yellow range. And even though that may not make that much difference for us, although I think you'll like it better, it's actually much better for wildlife. So there are some things you can do to help yourself. We're, of course, encouraging buildings and businesses to get involved, but you can also certify your home as dark sky friendly. If you go to darkskymissouri.org/home lighting, you could take the 5 principles that IDA and the Illuminating Engineering Society of America put together, and you can actually do a little audit of your home. And then you can, if you do the things that you're supposed to, you can actually apply and get a certificate for your house. A lot of times we do things for nature, but the truth is, if you do the right things around your home, you're probably going to be make some happy neighbors. A lot of times I think neighbors simply don't realize that they're putting lights into the windows of their home. And if you look around your house, frankly, it's also as pretty as it could be. It could be very disruptive to nature around you. So I'd like to thank you. Looks like I've kept my promise of about 15 minutes here. I encourage you to check out darkskymissouri.org, which is our website for our chapter in Missouri. We're a part of a large group called Dark Sky, which is an international group, and that's at darksky.org. And also encourage you to check out our Birds Lights Out project, which is lightsoutheartland.org. So these are some great websites with a lot of resources. All right, that's it.
Thank you very much, Don. Before folks that are attending, if you all want to put in questions into the Q&A or chat, don't be shy. I know in a lot of sessions we've had today, people start off a little bit shy. So I have a question about the light spectrum that you showed and sort of looking at the back of the box of bulbs when we go to buy them. Are the warmer lights that are better, which I certainly like them better myself also, are those less common these days than they once were? Like, is it harder to find the warm ones, or is it equally easy as the cool lights?
No, they're actually fairly easy to find. And frankly, it's just like buying. When we used to buy food, we didn't really look at the fat content, the calorie content. And so we started looking and go, wow, there it is right in the box. So you just have to look for it. A lot of times you can't tell by the face of the bulb. In other words, the bulbs will look the same on the outside, obviously not turned on, but when you look on the back, if today the old standard used to be actually 3,000 Kelvin, but IDA now is recommending 2,200 Kelvin, which is a lot warmer. And studies have shown that people really like that warmer color better, even though the bright white sounds better. Like, well, if it's brighter, it must be safer, which is not necessarily true. But I think people will actually like the warmer colors better.
And is there any trade-off in energy efficiency, or kind of how does that all go together? Can you comment on that?
So the energy efficiency is not necessarily related to the color temperature. In fact, even the brightness. Once you get up to a certain brightness, we were doing a study in Kansas City, and really a 3,000 Kelvin and 4,000 Kelvin are about the same price. So you really can't say that, one is necessarily less expensive than the other. The technology today is really quite impressive. You can do some very cool things, but the problem is we're only thinking of what we think about. We don't think about the brightness, for example. We tend to brighten things up a lot further, thinking it's a lot safer. And the funny thing about the safe thing is that people think that bright lights are safer, but the bright lights actually create more shadows, darker shadows, and you can hide in shadows, right? We actually joke in our IDA is that, well, gee whiz, if in fact the bright lights are safest, then why wouldn't New York be the safest place in the world? And when it really comes down to it. And so, in fact, in some cases, when you drive down the road and a street light's very bright and you go into a dark area and another street light's bright, what that does is our eyes simply cannot adjust to that fast change in brightness.
I've got a couple questions coming in here, Don. Are the solar lights designed for yards extremely disruptive in a garden setting? And are there different brightness levels that might be acceptable?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things to think about when you talk about particularly street, like sidewalk lighting or home lighting. First off is that I think you need to make sure it's pointed down. You can get a lot of lights that are simply almost like 360-degree lit up. And that means if you were to put your light where the light is, your hand where the light is, and you were to kind of draw out kind of horizontally, it brightens above that level. This is back to this question right here that I had. When you look at this, why would you light up above the sidewalk? It needs to be direct, in other words, shielded down, okay? The second thing is that people tend to get much brighter than they absolutely need to. You can dim it down considerably, 2,200 or even less than that, and you'll get plenty of sidewalk lighting and still look very pretty, when it comes down to it. And I think basically you probably don't need to have the sidewalk lit up all night. Why not put it on a timer, for example? Why not shut it off after a short time? But the truth is, I walk out and around my house, and frankly, any time of night, even without a street light, there's so much sky glow and there's so much lights everywhere that I could literally walk without any lights. And frankly, we don't turn the lights on at all in our house on the outside. We just don't need to.
Here's a good question about sort of the broader scale, organizational efforts and how to help with this. Any idea how in tune with these concepts are local communities or cities who provide the streetlights, and what would you suggest are the best ways to make those providers aware, besides the efforts of the organizations that you mentioned?
Yeah, so I guess you're talking about city officials, is that right? So basically,
it sounds like it. Yep.
Yeah. So what I find is that the cities, as they're considering this, they're basically sometimes only talked to by the people that are trying to sell them lights, right? They're not necessarily talking to people to say, let me balance all this together. There are studies, and this has gone on all over the country because a lot of the technology has been aging and they're wanting to replace lights. They'll have somebody come in and say, well, you really need to have these bright white lights and this is all the safer. And people just buy into that and they go, well, it's great. They tend to focus on brighter lights is better and they're also safer. And that is just not true at all. So some of the towns have put in these really bright white lights, and then they've had buyer's remorse. They are saying, wow, we should not have done that. We get a lot of complaints, even around my home right here in St. Louis. As I drive up to a stoplight, for example, there's a light so bright that I can hardly see the stoplight. It's just that bright, and it's not shielded or whatever else. I think the cities need to become more aware of what the International Dark Sky Association is recommending regarding lights. There's a lot of work out there being done by different cities, a lot of good benchmarks that they can learn from that. There's even good ordinances that are out there that are good model ordinances that they can look at. And there's no reason for them not to just to borrow that because this has been done by lots of cities. The city of Tucson is almost a model, really. They've done a really terrific job of reducing light pollution. And of course, they have a big observatory there, which is one of the reasons for that. But the citizens actually love it better. By the way, the IDA, the International Dark Sky, or even the Dark Sky Missouri website, if you come to us, there's a lot of resources that we can point you to. You don't need to make this stuff from scratch. There's a lot of model ordinances and a lot of information that we can give you just this off the shelf that's been used by others.
And Don, it sounds like from some of the conversations that have been had within Lights Out Heartland that the city of Kansas City is now going through the process that you just mentioned, where they're replacing a lot of the light. And it seems as though, either private citizens as individuals or maybe some of the conservation groups or astronomy groups are really having an effect on the conversation, right? Can you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, they have about my understanding, and I'm not directly involved in that, although one of our members is very heavily involved. They have about 90,000 street lights. This is pretty typical. Cities have had these lights for many, many years, and they're starting to come up with plans to replace them. So they have something like 90,000 lights. And so what we're trying to do is encourage them to install shielded lights that are 3,000 Kelvin below, and most importantly, to put in dimming technology. In other words, the ability to dim these things down. That's important because let's say, for example, even though LED lights seem like they last forever, they will lose some of their brilliance over time. With dimming technology, if you want a certain level of light, you can actually adjust the light level to offset that aging process, if you will. So Kansas City is still going through this, and I think with I think they picked up a Chicago early study that said, oh, bright lights are good, and then Chicago really rethought a lot of what they were doing, and so they're not necessarily getting caught up with the later facts. But cities in general, when they do their homework, are realizing that they can be very eco-friendly in terms of lighting and human-friendly because there are significant, by the way, we've talked about a few things that are, as far as nature, but it affects humans as well. I mean, think about melatonin in our bodies and how melatonin affects so many things. In fact, I was reading an article the other day about how COVID is actually considered a factor with melatonin, that maybe that melatonin has got some kind of effect with the way that COVID reacts to us. So there's a lot of things going on. We don't really understand all of it because until the 70s, we really weren't doing serious research. It wasn't even something that was on the radar screen. But there's clear that it's impacting nature, it's acting energy costs, obviously, wildlife, human health, safety. All those things are factors related to light.
All right. Thanks, Don. I don't see any more questions. And Karen, that asked the last question, said thanks. We have a comment. Excellent presentation. You have given so much food for thought, not just on a large scale, but for us as individuals. Thank you so much.
So let me add one more thing since I have just a few minutes. One of the things that we're attempting to do, what I found, at least we started our chapter about 2 years ago in Missouri, what I found is that there's really not a lot of awareness of even that light pollution exists or it's even an issue. And so one of the things we are attempting to do is we are launching a program to suggest to cities that they get their parks certified as an urban night sky place. It's a very cool thing. It can be, if they get them certified, which takes a year or two of things they have to do. They have to take, for example, inventories of their lights, and they have to do outreach programs. If they get themselves certified, they can be internationally recognized as an urban night sky place. We've actually applied in St. Louis. There's a city called Olivet, and it's a park called Stacy Park. It's about 35 acres. They have basically no lights. It's a perfect kind of place. We've been doing outreach programs and measuring light pollution and all that kind of stuff. But it's a very good way for a city to step into understanding how light pollution works. In other words, if you go to our darkskymissouri.org, you can go out and you can actually have your city registered to find out more about this. And we encourage that. But anyway, we're going to be talking with cities throughout the state in September as if part of the municipal league conference, encourage them to apply for the status. And we encourage you to have your city to consider that. Drop by a booth. I think it's booth 79 that will be in late September in St. Louis. It's a statewide conference. And talk with your park people. Just have them contact darkskymissouri.org, because there's not only a lot of fun that you can get as far as lights out, but we have actual outreach programs that they can deliver to the public about how nature's impacted by night, how stargazing is impacted by night, how birds are impacted by night, by the light at night, all those type of things. So it's a great way to add programs, if you will, to the park. And once we get them in hooked on that, we hope that they'll, of course, look at ordinances, and go beyond that.
Don, just to finish up, could you possibly flip back to your last slide again with the contact information?
Yeah.
Thanks. Perfect. So I just want to have that for folks. And if we don't have any questions or comments, then we'll wrap up. Thanks to everyone for coming. And I know every time that I talk to Don or see Don present, I always learn something. So I'm sure that was very educational for folks. And Don, I thank you so much. It's always great working with you.
Well, it's great work you're doing here. Thank you, Dana.
All right, everybody have a great rest of your day.